Alright, let's set the stage for what we call the Age of Pope, roughly the first half of the 18th century. This is often described as the Augustan age of English literature, and that term Augustan has been asked in exam. The name comes from the comparison with ancient Rome under Augustus Caesar, when writers like Horace and Virgil flourished. In England, it refers to the period when writers like Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, Addison, Steele, Gay, and Prior were at their peak. Now, the boundaries of this era are a little fuzzy. Some critics tie it tightly to the reign of Queen Anne, from 1702 to 1714. Others stretch it further, linking it back to Dryden before 1700 and forward to Samuel Johnson after 1750. Still, a clear marker is the deaths of Pope in 1744 and Swift in 1745. Those dates feel like a symbolic end to the Augustan spirit. So, what was going on historically? Queen Anne, born in 1665, ruled from 1702. In 1707, she became the first Queen of Great Britain when England and Scotland united under one crown. She also presided over a major victory in the War of Spanish Succession. But Anne was the last of the Stuart monarchs. All her children died young. So the Act of Settlement in 1701, yes, that act has been asked in exam, declared that the crown would pass to the Protestant Hanoverian line. In 1714, the Hanoverian succession took effect despite fierce Tory opposition. This political shift shaped the literature of the age. Writers like Addison, Steele, and Swift responded to the events of 1714 directly. By this time, English politics was divided between two parties, the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs valued personal freedom, supported mercantilism, and strongly backed the Hanoverian succession. The Tories leaned toward the divine right of kings, leaned high church in religion, and often sympathized with the Jacobite cause. These party differences, Whigs versus Tories, are exam favorites, so don't miss them. Even religion tied into politics. Whigs were low churchmen favoring tolerance and moderation. Tories were high churchmen stressing tradition and authority. And the War of Spanish Succession itself was led by the Tory commander Marlborough, though it was the Tories who ended it in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht. Now, what about literature itself? The Augustan style emphasized order, balance, and restraint, with a heavy influence from classical models. Pope himself gave us the rule: to copy nature is to copy the ancients. Satire became the great weapon of the time, sharp yet polished, often hiding its critique behind irony and calm phrasing. This is the era of polished couplets and carefully regulated forms, but at the same time, it begins to foreshadow the more emotional concerns of the Romantics. So, the Age of Pope wasn't just about poetry. It was shaped by politics, philosophy, and religion. It was the age of Whigs versus Tories, Queen Anne's wars and succession crisis, and the rise of satire and the essay. It was classical in style but modern in spirit, a bridge between the old world of courtly literature and the emerging modern world of the 18th century. Alright, let's move into the 18th century, beginning with the Hanoverian period. Now, this starts in 1714 when George I takes the throne. Here's the twist. George wasn't exactly first in line. He was the 52nd. But because he was the nearest Protestant heir, he got the crown. This detail, George being 52nd in line, has been asked in exam, so keep it in mind. Of course, not everyone was happy about the Hanoverians. The Jacobites wanted to bring back Stuart descendants and staged uprisings in 1715 and 1745. But despite these early challenges, the Hanoverian line turned out to be remarkably stable. 6 monarchs ruled from 1714 all the way into the 19th century, with George III holding the record as the longest reigning king of the period. This stability mattered. It gave Britain time to grow into a proper constitutional monarchy, with parliament and ministers running much of the show. The Whigs dominated 18th century politics, while the Tories rose again in the early 19th century. And here's another exam highlight. Robert Walpole, under George I and George II, is often called Britain's first Prime Minister. By the end of the period, reforms like income tax and the Great Reform Act had expanded the electorate, and Britain had become the world's leading empire. Even though it lost the American colonies, it gained dominion over almost a third of the globe. Now, alongside this political story comes an intellectual one, the Enlightenment. This was the great 18th century movement that emphasized reason over superstition. That definition itself has been asked in exam. Thinkers like John Locke in philosophy, Isaac Newton in science, and Voltaire in literature and politics spread new ideas across Europe and America. The Enlightenment promoted religious tolerance, openness to inquiry, and a spirit of investigation. It marked a huge turning point in Western civilization. The movement rested on 4 big ideas you should definitely remember. Rationalism, the belief that humans can gain knowledge through reason. Empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes from experience and observation. Progressivism, confidence that society can advance endlessly through rational effort. And cosmopolitanism, the sense that intellectuals saw themselves as citizens of the world, not just their own nation. These ideals shaped politics, literature, science, and even art. Which brings us to Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism rose as a reaction against the lighter, decorative Rococo style. Inspired by artists like Nicolas Poussin, Neoclassicists believed in solid drawing, clear form, and rational design. Jacques-Louis David became the star of the movement, with paintings marked by precision, smooth surfaces, and classical themes. Neoclassicism wasn't just an art trend, it reflected Enlightenment values. Moderation, rationality, and seriousness were the order of the day. That's why neoclassical art avoided showy colors or extravagant ornament. Instead, it emphasized clarity, sober tones, shallow space, and subjects drawn from classical history or myth. So, in short, the Hanoverian period gave Britain political stability, the Enlightenment gave Europe a new intellectual framework, and Neoclassicism gave art a rational, disciplined look. Together, they shaped the 18th century, and together they show up regularly in exams. Alright, let's step into the age of prose, the early 18th century, the time of Pope, Swift, Addison, and Steele. Now, here's the key thing. This period is often called Pope's age, but oddly enough, prose rather than poetry dominated the scene. Why? Well, poetical passion had begun to fade. Instead of soaring lyricism like in the Elizabethan age, writers now focused on wit, balance, and common sense. The heroic couplet was everywhere. In fact, Pope was its supreme master. People even joked that his poetry was really just rhymed prose, differing from prose only in the form of expression. That phrase has been highlighted in exam. So while poetry in Pope's lifetime was like lightning asleep behind a veil, prose took center stage. And where do we see that prose dominance? In the works of Swift, Addison, Steele, and Defoe. This was the age of satire, journalism, and political debate. Now, politics and writing were almost inseparable. Writers weren't just producing literature, they were influencing Whig and Tory politics. Some were rewarded with pensions, government posts, or political clout. Swift, for example, supported the Tories. Addison leaned toward the Whigs, though he was more cautious. Steele actually switched sides more than once. Pamphleteering was everywhere, with both factions using writers to spread their message. That era of political pamphlets has been directly asked in exam. But literature wasn't confined to parliaments and pamphlets. Coffee houses and clubs became the real hubs of discussion. Imagine it, lively debates, news, satire, and gossip all flowing over cups of coffee. Steele's Tatler was even organized around these clubs. In its very first issue, he announced, "Gallantry, pleasure, and entertainment would come from White's Chocolate House, poetry from Will's Coffee House, learning from the Grecian, and political news from St. James's Coffee House." That description has been lifted word for word into exam questions. Out of this culture also came famous associations like the Scriblerus Club and the Kit-Cat Club. Periodical writing really took off. Alongside the Tatler and the Spectator, there were politically charged journals like the Examiner and the Guardian. These were the birth of modern journalism, and they shaped public opinion in ways no previous literature had. At the same time, publishing itself was changing. The growing reading public, combined with a decline in drama, meant new opportunities for writers. Publishers like Jacob Tonson, Edmund Curll, and John Dunton hired armies of writers. But not all had prestige. Many became hack writers, grinding out pages just to survive. These hacks clustered around Grub Street, which became a byword for literary drudgery. And yes, Grub Street has been directly asked in exam. Finally, morality shifted during this age. The Restoration had been famous or infamous for its immorality. But with William III and Queen Anne, standards began to change. Addison, for example, made it his mission to mix wit with morality in the Spectator, shaping polite conversation and everyday ethics. Respect for women grew, though satire could still be coarse. So, the age of prose gave us satire, journalism, political debate, the coffeehouse culture, hack writers in Grub Street, and prose that defined an entire generation. Poetry may have dozed, but prose was wide awake. Alright, let's step into the literary world of the early 18th century, the age of classicism. Here, poetry looks very different from the fiery passion of the Elizabethans or the intellectual depth of the metaphysicals. Let's start with lyric poetry. Honestly, it almost disappears in this period. When it does appear, it tends to be light and artificial, more for wit and amusement than real feeling. If you want examples, look at Matthew Prior, John Gay, and Allan Ramsay. Their lyrics are pleasant but never profound. Now, the ode, the Pindaric form, limps along, but it doesn't thrive. Pope tried his hand at odes and failed, while Lady Winchelsea also produced some, but critics generally consider them mediocre. So, unlike later Romantic poets, this age didn't shine in lyric or ode. Where poetry does come alive is satire. Satire becomes the great mode of the time. Pope leads the charge with his Dunciad, which examiners love to bring up. Satire here is lighter, brighter, and more cynical than before, spreading into other poetic forms. In his later years, Pope even favored epistolary satire delivered in verse letters. Narrative poetry? Well, Pope's translation of Homer was the crown jewel. It gave him both money and fame. But when you compare it to Richard Blackmore's epics, the difference is clear. Blackmore's work feels heavy and dull. Meanwhile, John Gay and Matthew Prior revived the ballad form a little, though most of their imitations feel lifeless. The pastoral was another favorite, but here too it was more about polish than passion. Pastoral poems presented rustic life in a clean, artificial style. Pope and Ambrose Phillips are the main names to remember, though their shepherds lived in a very elegant, unrealistic countryside. Now, what about drama? Honestly, this was not the age for great plays. Restoration comedy had withered and very few tragedies made a mark. Addison's Cato is remembered as the only truly passable tragedy of the period. Steele wrote comedies that cleaned up the Restoration tradition, making them more moral but also less lively. The real standout is John Gay's The Beggar's Opera, which burst onto the stage with vitality, songs, and satire. That one is often asked in exam. Finally, prose. Here's where the age excels. Periodical literature. The Tatler and the Spectator especially transformed English prose style. Add in writers like Swift and Defoe, and you see why critics call this the true age of prose. So to sum up, lyric and ode were weak, satire triumphed, narrative poetry leaned on Pope's Homer, the pastoral was artificial, drama mostly faded, but prose with journalism, satire, and essays reached new heights.